I'm Van West. I'm the director of the Center for Historic Preservation at Middle Tennessee State University. And probably most pertinent for this discussion today, I'm the Tennessee State historian. So sometimes I never know what types of outreach that I'll get from citizens across the state. And 2 or 3 years ago, there was this message about a farm in Bedford County. And did I know anything about it? And I was like, yeah, I know a little bit about it. Would I come out to see it? And I said, yes, I will come out and see it. Be glad to meet with you and talk with whoever you want to have. Well, that began a great conversation for me that you guys will get a taste of today in the work of Danielle Chapman, and particularly her discussion with our own Fred Arroyo, an associate professor of English here at MTSU. Both of these authors have written insightfully and meaningfully about place. I know with Dr. Arroyo's work, I really liked his most recent book, Sown in the Earth, Essays in Memory and Belonging, which came out from Arizona Press in 2020. Place is important to us at the Center for Historic Preservation, trying to understand it, trying to document it, trying to preserve it. And that book is just another one of those that gets at what do we think when we're in different places, and what do we remember from those experiences. Danielle Chapman is a lecturer in English at Yale University. She took her MFA at the University of Virginia in 2003, and she has written many different essays, books of poetry. I really direct you to her poetry. That's where I first encountered her own work in a poem that she published in the New Yorker in 2015, and then was delighted when she came back with another publication in the New Yorker in 2017. But then she shared with us the work that she had been doing on her own history in the South, and particularly in Bedford County, and particularly the relationship between her family and the many singletons, as she called it in her very perceptive essay from the Oxford American in 2018. And all of those things have come together to bring us to today's session, where she is going to read from her new book called Holler. And I think I pronounced that in the good Tennessee way. And then she and Dr. Arroyo will have a discussion of how do you write nonfiction in a fiction setting and vice versa, and all of those themes that run through both of their works. We're so honored to have both Danielle and Dr. Arroyo here with us today. And with no further ado, I'll turn the stage over to Danielle Chapman.
Thank you so much. So of all the events that I've done for this book, this one is my favorite. This is number one. That's because this is closest to the house that's at the center of this book. And as Elwood McMahon, who I think is not here today but is here in spirit, has said that this house is on a place that is sacred ground. That's definitely true for me. It's the place where my soul was forged, my poetic consciousness, but maybe more so my conscience and my ideas about what America is, what America should be, but also a lot of ideas about family and history itself. The truth is that place is sacred ground to so many people, including some people who are here today, and all the people who have brought this together. Just thank you so much to Dr. West and to Antoinette and to Professor Arroyo, and also to the family members who are here, the Singletons and McMahons. The truth is that this is one of two books that we're kind of celebrating today because MTSU, the Center for Historic Preservation, has just finished a report on the house, which goes much further into the history of it. Some incredible research by their students and by the center, and also not only history on the house, but the African American cemeteries that are associated with the house, and people who were once enslaved at the house, their descendants. So it's a reminder to me that this group in particular is part of a much bigger story. My story is one little piece of it, and also I feel this very strongly in this setting that it's a story that's kind of just started. This is a new chapter of it, but we don't know exactly what it means yet. I think we've inherited a story, but we're finding something new and figuring out where to go from here as well. So I'm going to read from the book a little bit. I should start by saying that this book, which is a memoir, kind of a strange memoir, but it starts with my father's death. My father was a Marine, and he was stationed in Okinawa, and he died in a scuba diving accident when I was not quite 3 years old. And what happened after that was my mother almost died as well. She was in the waves with him, and she survived. And when she realized that she was alive, but her husband had died, she made a sort of unusual decision. She decided to go back and live with his family. My father's father was the commandant of the United States Marine Corps. He was General Chapman. Everybody knew him that way. And the house in Tennessee was the house that he had inherited from his mother, and it had come down through many generations. So as a very small child, I was brought from the scene of this tragic event right into the South, and into a lot of American history, as well as this kind of high octane military environment. So I think I'll speak into this, and somebody might have to reattach this to my ear later. Or no, do I still need it? Okay, it's falling off. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to read from, I'm going to skip around a little bit, but I'm starting just right there, describing the experience of arriving in this. I'll just say quickly, the house was originally built in 1790 as a tavern at the edge of the Western frontier. And, not too much has changed in the house since then. A few months after Okinawa, I found myself in Fairfield, Tennessee. One minute, I was watching the sky pearl to a weird phosphorescent yellow as my babysitter seized me and tried to shield my eyes. The next, I was sitting in the lap of General Leonard Fielding Chapman, Jr. in his ancestral home, a broken-down tavern built in 1790, where it had been forbidden to move the furniture since the Confederacy fell. I woke into American history as if into a second childhood, with the foreboding that it would one day be mine to own. I could never wake up earlier than Papa, though. Well, 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 he'd say in the low, teasing baritone that was his signature when I crept into the kitchen at 5:30 a.m. every morning of every summer. Good afternoon. Then we'd take our coffee cups, his a ceramic urn sealed with a Scottish falcon for Leonard, mine filled 3/4 of the way with cream, out onto the back porch to watch the sun come up. I knew that I was in the presence of an important man. He didn't wish to disguise it entirely. Gravity hung on at the edges of his genial face, a newspaper tint, a residue of Washington. As the grown-up said, he would be my father now. One morning, one of those first Fairfield summers, after the sun had burned up over the corn, Papa looked at me significantly and said, "Come on, sit on Papa's lap. I'll tell you a story." It was the story of George Singleton, a man enslaved by my great-great-great-grandfather who saved my great-great-grandfather's life and our family from ruin. I was not to interrupt. I am going to interrupt myself and my grandfather here very briefly to tell you the story. I tell the long version in the book, and we don't quite have time, so I just want to tell you the facts of this extraordinary story, which are that, as my grandfather told it, George and Robert were exactly the same age, both born in, I believe, 1842, and grew up together as boys, and very close to each other. When the Civil War started, Robert went and fought for the Confederacy. At the time, though, Tennessee was already moving. Some parts of Tennessee had already been conquered by the North. And so relations were changing somewhat. And there is a letter in which Robert writes home and asks his mother to send George to help him on the battlefield if he wants to. And there was a letter. This letter was framed in the house in Tennessee. And, my grandfather showed it to me. George did go, and Robert was soon in the battle, and he very quickly got his leg shot off. George went out to the battlefield and pulled him off the battlefield and got him to the medic tent where he recovered. George then went and joined the Union Army and went to fight for the Union and was in the Union Army for several years and until the end of the war. So when the Union won, George returned to Fairfield, and as the story went, nobody had any money. The white family was ruined because Confederate money was worthless, and George used his Union pension to get them back up on their feet. And later on, the white family helped George buy a piece of land in return for everything that he had done. So a lot of the rest of this chapter talks about me wrestling with this story as an adolescent and having a hard time believing it. I grew up outside of DC. Was pretty liberal, still am, in a lot of ways. But I was very obsessed with questions of race, and I just couldn't believe that a story like this was true. And my grandfather and I had a lot of arguments, about the state of things in America, about economic injustice, a lot of which I think were still valid. But then something very unusual happened. When I was about 21, my grandfather got a call from the descendants of George Singleton, and they invited him to their reunion. And so the reunions began, and they have been happening ever since, and they're still happening. And my grandfather passed away about 2 years after they began, but they've since evolved in many ways, and they're really one of the biggest gifts in my life. So I'm going to read a little bit from one of those reunions, and that will be it. Okay. While I haven't been able to make it to all the reunions, whenever we're in town, several of George's local descendants drop by to sit on the back porch and drink iced tea and tell stories. A few times we've talked about writing a book together. At one point, Mike Davis and I hatched a plan to start collaborating. At the end of our last phone call, he said, "We've got to tell this story to the world because it's just like 12 Years a Slave, but without any of the hatred or bitterness." Mike and I have yet to collaborate, though, and I confess I haven't pursued this course as hard as I could have. I worry that a white person can't utter such a tagline without coming across as an apologist for slavery. If I'm being truthful, though, I must admit to a different concern. In order to tell the story of George Singleton as it deserves to be told, with George and his descendants as the rightful protagonists, with their story with their history as the history, I worry that I'd have to jettison the details that I inherited and observed in childhood, details of a Southern culture and mentality that may well have been fabricated in the service of propping up dead or malevolent ideals, details that in principle I am happy to torch alongside the Confederate flag, but which in memory remain indelible and which are the only proof that this place in which my father and my grandfather and his grandfather were all once children is real. I worry that I'd lose the proofs of my own existence. That is, of course, a melodramatic way of looking at it, a white way, one might say. For the reality is that in America, it's Black folks whose histories have most often disappeared without a trace. In Fairfield, one need only roll back a desktop to see that. Several summers ago, Josephine and Fred Davis, George Singleton's great-granddaughter and her husband, came to Fairfield for a visit. In 1967, Fred opened the first African-American-owned insurance company in the South. Before that, Black people could legally own homes but couldn't get them insured, which effectively made home ownership impossible, as a mortgage could only be obtained with a guarantee of insurance. The Davises brought friends of theirs. Walking through the house, the friends gasped in awe and horror at all of the precariously preserved oldness. Most shocking to them was the long porch, bookended in screens and barely preserved from the elements, where my great-grandmother's complete library rotted like wet leaves, ruined ideas of the late 19th century. The couple suggested getting a couple of PhD students from Tuskegee, they knew just the ones, in to catalog it all. My aunt and uncle politely said sure, and we all drank our iced tea. As everyone was doing one last tour through the house, someone noticed Sally Singleton's old secretary, which is like a little desk, and asked what was in it. It was the desk where Papa had kept the phone numbers for the lumber yard and the restaurant at Cortner's Mill. But when we opened it, I remembered that it was full of pigeonholes, and each pigeonhole bore its own strange stash. One was stuffed with business cards, another with birthday notes. Then we found a roll of cash, Confederate greenbacks. In the last cubby hid a small, ancient, leather-bound notebook. Peeking inside the cover, we saw that it belonged to John Scott, Robert Singleton's grandfather, one of Fairfield's original settlers, and the man I startled to remember Papa had referred to casually as the slave trader at the end of the road. Nobody wanted to touch it. We all just stared at it, diabolically valuable and unprotected. Afterwards, my aunt tucked it in her suitcase and smuggled it back to Western Massachusetts in alarm at the idea of some trespassing rednecks getting their hands on it. And just like that, it was as if we'd never found it in the first place. I'm just going to read one more small bit from after this, from coming to another reunion after this, where after we talked about all of this, talked about the diary, talked about kind of the various versions of history and wondering which exact ones were true. And after that had kind of relaxed into something that I've just come to think of as fellowship. I mean, I can't keep going without mentioning the wonderful people in this room who are here today and who have just brought a spirit of generosity and love that is truly supernatural, in my opinion. And so, hey. But so this is, kind of a moment afterwards where I'm just trying to reconcile all of that. Here, this diary exists, this terrible original sin exists alongside this beautiful story of friendship and alongside the friendship that's in the present. So one more brief passage. After everyone had left, another hard afternoon rain came through, followed by a lemony late evening sun. I walked down to the river in that calm, wondering how I could possibly contain it all. The greens and browns and creams unloosed, the light, mild and various as melons. How would I ever explain why we baked Elwood MacMahon 3 blackberry cobblers from berries picked that morning? How the canes ached with all that glowering a good soak in sugar water would have sweetened, as Fred Davis pointed out. My footprints sank in the wet violets humped between the wheel ruts everyone had driven over to get there. I heard the river gushing through the holler, and I remembered that as a girl, I wasn't allowed to go down to the water alone. The storm now made the danger of it plain. Mud gushed between banks, sloshing torrents, and the heron who usually stands on the gravel bar glided above, searching for higher ground. I stood there, surveying the tumult. The risk of this place, of loving it, of owning it, had never been clearer. Then, out of the river's rush, I heard a chirp, raspy, loud, an unfamiliar bird gnawing into the air, half warble and half bark. I couldn't imagine what it was. The sound was entirely new to me, and it repeated insistently. I looked down and onto the bleached out fork of a caught tree trunk that stuck out of the rocks for 20 years, a creature nosed up. A snapping turtle or a snake, I assumed. But no, now the whole oil can head appeared, then hand-like paws grasping, then the body, a foot of pelt and sinew intermingled. An otter. I stared. I'd never seen an otter in Fairfield, nor heard that anybody had. He stiffened his neck and barked, a hoarse and woeful plea. He was so close to me that I could see the valves of his nostrils dilate. Then he barked again, and they emerged on the opposite bank. 5 more otters. They wriggled out into the water, swiftly muscling against the boils to reach his call, bounding to our side of the river. And when they were close, he aimed himself into the current and leapt, so that one by one they crashed into him and clutched. In that instant, they made of themselves a raft, and without hesitation, the first otter began guiding them downstream, dodging the branches that had been dashed down by the storm. They held on to him and to each other, slick backs writhing, riding the flood together, and disappeared around the bend. Thank you.
Thank you for having me up here. It's a pleasure and an honor. This was a wonderful book to read, and you read two of the passages that I turn to a lot in thinking about things today.
And thank you so much for doing this. It's been
No, it's fine. I'm a little nervous, so I'm a text person, so I'll probably read. Can't remember everything about the complexity of the book. But that's a good thing. You mentioned this a little bit, but for those who haven't read the book, when you read the preface, you begin to describe some of the struggles of writing the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wondered if you could begin the conversation this afternoon by sharing some of the ethical and moral dilemmas you struggled with to write the book.
Sure, yeah. Well, I start out by saying I didn't really want to write a memoir. I teach at Yale, which is a very particular place. And there was a way in which I didn't want to have to write about, all the gnarly things that go on in the South. A lot of the book, the first few chapters, the chapter I read from today is the 5th chapter. So the first several chapters are more about my childhood, before the reunion started and before I met any of the Singleton descendants, when I was really encountering sort of the old South, the unreconstructed South that still existed at that house and in the personalities of a lot of people around it. And yet these personalities, this place, these stories, just kept haunting me. I couldn't get away from them. And partly that was, so many of the people I'd grown up around who were older, old people. I grew up around grandparents, and I was just thinking the other day, I have a picture of like my 8th birthday party, because my birthday's on Christmas, but we'd have half birthdays down at the house, and I have a picture of a birthday party where it's me and like 8 80-year-olds, with everybody with a birthday hat on, so in a way, I was just kind of like, I was surrounded by these larger than life personalities, my grandparents, and just kind of compelled to bring them back to life, but then wondering what that meant to do that, because it also meant bringing the ideas that they'd imported with them from the old South, not necessarily fully. My grandfather was pretty conscious in a lot of ways, but it just meant that then I would have to, it couldn't be a memoir that was uncomplicated, and simply talking about my origins or identity.
And when you have the pleasure to read the book, you'll experience a lot of Danielle's anger and confusion, even rage, I would say. And there's some suffering in writing about the past. But rather than being a political argument or a quest at a time when identity politics are so central, reading your memoir is a metaphysical exploration of the past and the present, an exploration that suggests an essential question: what is the soul of history? And you read from those pages 168 through 169, which is based on this question. So what do you feel you've discovered about that soul, especially in sharing what you describe at one point as the proof of place, which includes your personal history, but also the history of the Singletons?
I love how you framed that, the idea that there's a soul of history, because we don't usually think of it like that, but certainly in this place, I think one feels that, and I certainly do. And I did begin to think of it as much less of a political project and more of a metaphysical or spiritual project, partly because it seemed to me that it was so much about the longing for forgiveness, and mercy, but not only for my ancestors, but for myself. And that in order to do that, I really had to be humbled in a way, because, and I think that, the George Singleton's descendants, the Singletons and MacMahons, have showed me a lot about that, when I see their family together, when I see the way a spirit of forgiveness can flow through a family. That is humbling, but also, my ideas had to be humbled, I think, to some degree, because as a Northerner, as a person who looks at these issues, especially when I was an adolescent, I looked at them pretty ideologically, and a lot of times thinking about, wanting to be right, just that's often what it comes down to, and I thought of myself as very race conscious and, woke before woke was a thing. And I wanted to be right. And I had to be humbled into understanding that these weren't ideas only that I was encountering. These were people who had their own histories, had their own very complicated lives and traumas and histories, and so I'd say that's a long answer, but I'd say for me, getting closer to the soul of history has been a process of being humbled by it, and by the histories of those around me.
And that's got that moment on 168, 169 is it's at a reunion, and Mike Davis is saying, like, let's write this book together, Danielle. Let's write George's story.
Yeah.
And it'll be another big blockbuster, like 12 years of his life.
Right. Right.
And you're like, I don't know if I can do it. Too much of yourself thinking that way. Which leads me to just thinking about, there's a bunch of my students here today. And they read a couple chapters, but the creative risks that are at the heart of vulnerability, because I admire, and I think others will admire it too, how you've composed and structured Holler with a lot of white space and silence. There's concision and compression. It's a very small book, so we know that that's not everything, but it's all selected and chosen. I would say like a breath of space for contemplation too. Why do you think that, and you may have answered this in some ways, but why is vulnerability so important to risk and writing about the things you're writing about?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I think maybe the short answer is because that's the only way to get to the truth. But also, as you put it, it's also like, it's such a temptation to tell the story that makes you feel good about yourself. And I think one reason it took so long for me to write this book, and there's like 10,000 pages that didn't end up in here, so maybe those are the white spaces that you're talking about. But when people hear the story of George and Robert Singleton, it's incredibly inspiring. And, a lot of times people will say, somebody should make a movie about this story. And my grandfather, I think, felt that way too. And sometimes I felt like a real killjoy, like here I am, the writer, I should go and write this darn movie, but ultimately I think that, Dr. West has a good way of seeing this, which is that I might have been able to do that if I didn't get interested in history, because the thing is, as he says, history is the ultimate, it is what it is. And so, once you start digging in and uncovering all of this information, you can't really rely anymore on the sentimental or the thing that makes you feel good. And I think that that sentimentality is often what prevents vulnerability, because it, when you tell the truth, it doesn't, it's not pat. It opens up a place where you can get hurt.
A wound.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. And you keep coming back to this, that for the art of nonfiction, creative nonfiction, you're really not beginning with the truth. You have to go through the process of diving into everything, that history and the complexity, and then discovering that truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it's like it's very, like I was saying at the beginning, I think this story is incredible. And I truly consider it one of the great gifts of my life that I get to be a part of it. But I can't claim to know exactly what it means, that we all have reunions and that we all have these relationships that are still evolving. I find it incredibly hopeful. It seems to me like it's something that is so rare and so beautiful. But I can't claim to, I think that in the past, there might have been a temptation to say, well, what this means is that, my family was the good kind of white people. And, we were, our people were kind. And, that's why we, and maybe this was true in this one case. I mean, it does seem that there was a very true love between Robert and George Singleton that lasted their whole lives. The way I kind of think of it is, I just came here from a church in Memphis, so I feel like maybe I better say this, which is that the way I think of it is, there's a light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot extinguish it. That doesn't mean the darkness isn't there. I feel like I got off on a tangent, but I'm going to end with that.
This is off script. You keep bringing up the word gifts, and it's been circulating all week when I meet with my students. And it was the other day I was in the fiction writing class trying to do a 10-minute little talk about your book to get them to come. And we had read Flannery O'Connor's Writing Short Stories. And I didn't necessarily want to bring up that essay, but it is interesting because, so many people want to cancel her at this moment for certain reasons. But in that essay, she talks about how you have to, if you're going to write, you have to accept the texture of your existence. She doesn't name what that thing is, but it's the texture. And then she says, and if you're from the South, that's the problem, is you're going to follow things in the North or follow things in the larger culture, and then you might not accept the gifts of your region. And that just seems a couple of really central things about your own book, that you had to accept those gifts of the region and the texture of your existence.
Yeah, I love that. And that's part of the humbling as well, because in a way, here I had been, an adolescent who thought I knew everything. And I'm even like going up and arguing with my grandfather, who's coming out of the Marine Corps all the time, telling him thinking that I know better. And, even particularly about matters of race. And I didn't read the really embarrassing parts of the memoir where I'm really trying to be down, when I'm a teenager. I couldn't bear you all seeing me confess that. But and then here it happens that my grandfather's the one who, Mike gets in touch with. And they invite my grandfather to the reunion. And then my grandfather calls me and said, oh, well, I'm having a reunion with George Singleton's descendants. Do you want to come? I was like, well, what, and there's a part of me that just felt, so blindsided, because this thing had happened that came from so far sideways, and it required me to just go there and see what happened, and also to accept the gift. Accept the gift of that relationship, or those many relationships, which, I feel like I should also say, this isn't really a theme book, but I'm an only child, I'm an only grandchild on both sides, and in the summer, I get to come down to Tennessee and be surrounded by like 100 people who really treat me like family. So that's, the gift is not just narrative.
That you, again off script, but you're reminding me too of your grandfather's motto was "Don't look back." But then there's a key moment in the book where you stop and say, "Why do I keep going back to these memories? Why can't I just leave it alone? But I have to keep returning to it." But when you read the book too, it seems like the complexity of history is that you're looking back on it and you have distance and knowledge, and yet as you're writing it, you just keep going back to these little discoveries in life that made that history come alive. And one of those was your grandfather saying, "Don't look back, that's my motto," and yet you learn that he did a lot of things for the military in terms of segregation.
Yeah, yeah. So should I tell that story?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was something that just kind of blew my mind. There's in the fourth chapter, which is primarily about Vietnam. When my grandfather died, I sort of thought of him, as a conservative. He was a Southern Marine Corps guy. I mean, he wasn't that explicit, not like it is now. It was different, but when he died, the New York Times published his obituary, and one of the first things in the obituary was about the strides that he'd made in civil rights during his time in the commandant, as commandant. And it was so strange because he had never told me that. And so as part of this book, and I think a lot, I overuse the word humbling, but part of that is after my grandfather died, just coming to terms with how little I knew about him, about his career, about his history, my grandmother's history, about American history, period. And so, over the course of writing this, I've done some research and, some reading, and I went to the Marine Corps Archives in Quantico, and what I discovered was, I can't remember the number, it's in here, I think it's 33 boxes of hate mail about something called the Afro haircut correspondence. And what it was that during Vietnam, when there was a lot of racial unrest in the country and the Black Power movement was very prevalent, there was a lot of unrest in the Marine Corps. And what my grandfather did was, instead of kind of cracking down on that, he instituted some rules that said that Black Marines could wear their hair in a modified afro, and that they could pick their own music on the jukeboxes, and they could give each other the Black Power salute as a sign of solidarity. And he got 33 boxes of hate mail, from people who thought this was the most terrible thing anybody had ever done, and you're ruining the Marine Corps, and he never rescinded the order. It was an order. There were many other parts of the order that were more basic civil rights regulations, because his idea was that the real problem, the reason that this racial unrest was occurring, was because Black Marines were facing discrimination, not because of these, Black Power salutes and things like that. And so, so this was like the biggest controversy of his career. He made this, he stuck to his guns, he received all this hate mail, and then through all these years, he never told me. And I don't know why. Although I wonder, I know he was wise, but the self-control that it must have taken for him to just decide, oh, she won't believe it unless she finds out for herself. If he had that kind of foresight, thought, she's going to go to the Marine Corps Archives one day and, find the Afro haircut correspondence. I don't know. I do feel that he's somewhere chuckling happily right now, seeing that happened.
Well, maybe smiling too, because you mentioned this. You wanted to be right, and you had to write this book to discover being right isn't the best thing. You get in the way of it.
Right, and being right is not. Being right is complicated. It's multifaceted, as is being wrong.
So we're going to move, I think, to audience questions. I think there's about 20 minutes left, or a little bit less. But just one more to lead into that, I guess, if that's okay. It was in you read the part near the end of the book, which is one of my favorite parts. Is really lyrical, poetic part. Being in the holler as an adult in the water, but remembering your childhood, and it being for others a place of danger. And it's a really great moment because there's the deep imagery of your father drowning in the language, and yet also the care and love that Papa, your grandfather, your mother, and your relations offered in looking after you so you wouldn't be in danger. But then you're there and you just have this wonderful moment, first time where these otters, appear. And it just made me think that in the South, it's part of, I think, what I focus on sometimes too, and Dr. West got at this, the place or landscape itself is storied. I mean, it has stories woven into it, and those stories are hateful and terrible, and they're dangerous. But at the same time, that moment, it was as if there wasn't any danger there at all. If you would just listen a little bit, the landscape the place had another story that it wanted to tell you. So it's such a powerful moment of identity, family, and place, and the natural world offering any of us these unexpected moments. That's important to you, and you think it's important for however we start to talk about the history in the South as we keep going forward.
Well, I can't quite resist telling one other story real quick related to that, just because I think that you put that so well. But the idea, and I think it's what we all need now, is to believe that those places can be reborn somehow. So I have to tell you, it's not in the book. I don't know why I didn't put it in there. I think I know why. I just didn't think anybody would believe it. But the truth is that Elwood and Elsie McMahon baptized me in that river when I was 25 years old. And it was a surprise baptism. So, everybody's laughing. There's ways to reimagine that. There's explicit ways, I think, to be reborn, and it's true that there's life left in these places, new life. So I believe that.
Thank you.
Thank you both for such an enlightening and enjoyable conversation. And now we'll get to questions from the audience. And my name is Antoinette Banzelm. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Historic Preservation. And I've got two colleagues here, Savannah Grandini and Stacey Graham, and they've got microphones. And so if anyone wants to raise their hand, and we'll have some questions.
This is. Yes. This is my neighbor. One of the things that struck me that I had to say to somebody, so I'll say it to you, is how much water affects all the parts of this story. That every part of it has to, your father drowning, you're drinking a glass of water, the baptism. Is that a theme that as a poet struck you?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think, I've always loved to swim. I've always loved that river. There is just something so primal and spiritual, I think about water.
Story is the thing about the otters is just strikingly wonderful.
It is. I know, and it's the kind of thing, it's the kind of thing it's not quite the end of the book, because what I say in the next part is, it's the kind of thing that, you wonder whether that could really be true. whether something so seemingly otherworldly and yet so meaningful, it feels so much like a sign,
Yeah,
you know,
and then we got to witness.
yeah. And so I think in the thing about you know, when dealing with our history, which is difficult and can be very harrowing and overwhelming to think about, what I try to just remember is that there are these points of light, and you kind of have to believe in them because, you know, you can talk yourself out of them.
There's one at the back.
First, I want to say thank you. This has been a really great talk. I wondered in the actual writing process, the nonfiction writing process, did you pay specific attention to the fiction language of poetry in order not to almost cross the line and blur what is nonfiction to fiction?
I can't say I was that conscientious. In some parts of the book actually felt almost, in terms of their form, like writing short stories to me. But it's all true. What do you mean by, when you say fiction language, is there something specific you're thinking about?
Yeah, no, not in yours. Just recently with a lot that I have been personally reading in my studies. Some authors are writing nonfiction work, but they are fiction, almost over description writers, and it comes off that way, but yours does not. So I just wondered if you were careful when you were writing, or if you were thoughtful of that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think maybe this may be a sideways answer, but since I'm primarily a poet, sometimes it's really the language drives what I'm writing. And I think part of the reason that it took me so long to write it wasn't just dealing with all these strands of history and story, but also I kind of can't let something go like a paragraph or a section until it sounds right. You know, and so for me, it's often the sound of the words, the sounds of the sentences that show me where I'm going.
So as you were writing the book, did you have a specific way that you accessed memories? Like, did you just meditate on things? Like, how did you bring those memories to life as you were writing?
Well, so that's an interesting question. So some of them, I hope I don't sound too strange confessing this, but some of them were a little bit like possessions, you know, like feeling a little possessed by certain characters. Couldn't get them out of my head, and then I'd get sort of a wave of inspiration and just remember everything about them, like remember how they talked, and it was like I was hearing them, and you know, remembering every little detail about how they dressed it, you know, and it was just kind of, I would have to sort of pour that out. Unfortunately, those moments, which I would call, you know, moments of inspiration, similar to what it kind of feels like to write a poem, you know, couldn't write a whole book that way. And so then a lot of it was holding on to those pieces that really felt to me like they were the core of the book and the inspired part of the book, and then finding ways to piece them together with other things that I was thinking about.
Something that I wrote down was the temptation to tell the story that makes you feel good about yourself. And then shortly after you said, you can't rely on the sentimental in the face of it is what it is. And you also mentioned feeling humbled, and also that there were stories that didn't even make it into the book. Were there any parts where you wrote those feel good things? And if so, what point did you say this doesn't have space here? How did you go about separating the two, like in that very fine line, I guess?
Yeah, well, this is maybe not quite so much about being sentimental, although maybe it is in a way, more about really feeling good about myself, like feeling like the preface is sort of about how when I started writing this, it was during the Trump years, and I really just wanted to write some progressive prophecy that told everybody how wrong they were and how right I was. And I would write those things, like long lectures, telling everybody what to do. And then I would go back and I would see that it was terrible writing. And it was just kind of dead on the page. And I think that's what I tell students that Hemingway had a quote, which was, what you should do with a story is, write it, put it in a drawer for 6 months, or maybe it was 6 weeks. Since the semester is not 6 months long, make it 6 weeks. And take it out again, and if it doesn't make you throw up, then you keep it. And that's, I don't know if that gives me a lesson about sentimentality, but I think that's good advice. It's often the sentimental or like the really self-aggrandizing, where you're really making yourself try to look good. That doesn't wear too well. Give it a little time.
Thank you so much for this talk. I'm really, so enjoying being here and listening to you to read from the book. I'm kind of building off of some of these other questions here. I wanted to ask about, 10,000 plus pages potentially of writing that were scrapped and didn't make it into the final book. I'm sure some of that at least was exactly what you were just talking about. Is any of that, do you ever see it as being part of another publication, or is it just what you had to go through to write in order to come to this final piece?
I'm not sure. I think there's some parts. There's some things that, anybody who's writing here, you know the phrase "kill your darlings." There's some very cute darlings sitting there, just hoping that I'll remember them. I will say that it feels good to be done with this. And I do feel like there's kind of another book, but it's different, and maybe it's not just me who needs to write it, but it's more about these different branches of the story. I'm still incredibly interested in everything, particularly that comes out of that last chapter. But I don't have firm designs on it yet.
I'm already looking forward to it if it ever comes to be.
Another question.
Some of my questions have been answered in the last two, but specifically I'm curious about, obviously in fiction versus nonfiction, how do you don't have your pat ending. Did you know your otter encounter was going to be how you completed your story, or did that take you a while to get to? How do you find your ending in a nonfiction piece?
Well, so that's interesting. I think when that happened, it wasn't just, it did feel like, maybe the book is done. But I'll tell you, that was originally the very end of the book. It isn't in the final version. What it ends with is, this is just very short. I'll just say, the next paragraph is, I know the otters happened. I saw them with my own eyes as surely as anything in these pages, but more than that, I believed them. For I'd arrived at that place past meanings where the soul's only choice is to open itself to signs, and the sign that I received was one of mercy. Yet, in the wake of a vision, reality's wickedness is particularly fresh. And the final few pages is a description of John Scott's diary. And, you know, I think that I was sort of tempted to have a Hollywood ending. It was actually my editor who said, I think you need to rearrange that. And I think he was right. Not because the darkness is always stronger than the light, I don't believe that, but it is more actual, and it's always persistent, and it's going to be there. And, you know, I think believing and hoping for something better is something that's kind of more in our hearts than in the newspapers. So.
Well, thank you, everybody. Further questions? Danielle will be signing in books and selling some books, so if you have further questions, I'm sure you can ask her in person then. I just want to thank everybody for coming. Make sure to get a cookie and some lemonade on your way out, but first of all, let's give a final round of applause to everybody.